If you are still eating, please continue as we will proceed to tonight's presidential address. It is my distinct honor to introduce our president for this past year, Dr. Eva Baham. She earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in journalism from Southern University in Baton Rouge and a Master of Arts as well as her PhD in American History from Purdue University, and is currently Assistant Professor of History at Dillard University. Prior to her appointment at Dillard, Dr. Baham was Associate Professor of History at Southern University, Baton Rouge for 20 years. Her work and service as a historian has focused on African American history. Within this framework, Dr. Baham has presented numerous papers and published widely on such topics as religion and education. She is the author of The Grand Rallying Point: Methodists, Congregationalists, Baptists, Episcopalians, and Jews Forge a Lesson and a Legacy in Interfaith Cooperation, published in Intersections, Faith, Church, and the Academy, edited by Mark E. Hanshaw and Timothy Moore in 2018. Excuse me. Searching for Duplan and Zoe amid the contradictions of being slave and free in the Journal of Louisiana Creole Research Association in 2016, and an essay on black women teachers from the 19th century to the present entitled Early Educators, which was published in Black Women in America, Volume 1 in 2005, edited by Darlene Clark Hine. Dr. Baham is also the author of African Americans in Covington, published in 2015. Dr. Baham has also volunteered her time as an expert consultant, in particular to the City of New Orleans Street Renaming Commission, as well as for several documentary projects, including All Over But the Cry, the Louisiana Tidal Wave of 1957, and as a member of the advisory board for Teaching the Levees, a curriculum for democratic dialogue and civic engagement, which was created to accompany the HBO documentary series When the Levee Broke, a Requiem in 4 acts by Spike Lee. She is currently consulting on a Louisiana documentary project for Sprite Halo LLC out of Los Angeles. As a longtime educator, she has mentored and shaped the lives of countless students who have gone on and become successes in their own right. Dr. Baham is also a founding member of the Charles Delon branch of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and a board member of the Louisiana Creole Association. I ask you to join me in a round of applause to welcome our president, Dr. Eva Baham.
Searching for my people in Louisiana, one day a genealogist and a historian walked into the archives. The lovely handwritten script of the official registrar of the St. Tammany Parish Clerk of Court unintentionally conveys a realm of emotions and the gravity of the occasion for Duplan Rose and his wife, Zoe DePere. They arrived at the courthouse on February 17, 1870, with their 6 children: Macedonia, 13, Robinson, 11, Willis, 9, Joseph, 6, James, 4, and Mary Elizabeth, 1.5. And by the authority of state legislature, declares, putting that it is their wish and intention to acknowledge and legitimate all of their children, unquote. They further declared that on December 24th, 1868, they legitimized their 15-year relationship, out of which their 6 children were born, hence the reason for the formalities. Article 95 of the Civil Code of 1825 It prohibited marriages between slave and free. That law subjected this family since 1853 into, quoting, cohabitation and living together, unquote. As their household awakened each day during those 15 years prior, the hope must have embraced a vision for a radically changed social order. Although the end of the Civil War effectively ended designations between free and slave, Duplin and Zoe's 1868 marriage license and the 1870 document legitimizing their children noted that they were, quoting, free people of color, unquote, a linguistic extension of Louisiana's antebellum social stratification. The language possibly reassured them of their liberated status so soon after the end of the Civil War. Perhaps as well for the dignity and pride of the former slave Duplin and his wife, who had lived both as slave and free in her early childhood. They each had traveled a long, winding and arduous journey as, quoting, a mixed couple. He, a slave, born in North Carolina, sold into Louisiana from birth until the Civil War freed him. She, born a slave in Louisiana with perennial roots in the Caribbean, who then became an emancipated woman. 65 years and 2 months after the Rhodes family made their existences legal in southeast Louisiana, trauma visited itself upon a 9-year-old girl in southwest Louisiana. Her grandmother, Adele Richard White, along with an adult daughter and son, reared the child in a pleasant household. She was a precocious only child in the household of the French and English-speaking adults, one of whom was the child's Aunt Eva White Cloud, and the other, the child's Uncle Miles White. Aunt Eva, who became a widow 10 years earlier at 26 years old, was childless, and she often playfully allowed the 9-year-old to, quote, help with her makeup, interspersed with lots of laughter. The child's Uncle Miles, the last of the sons remaining at home and a lifelong bachelor, took the role of the patriarch since the death of his father. And little Dorothy White, the 9-year-old, little Dorothy White's grandmother, Adele, whom she, the child, affectionately and tellingly called Mama, could be seen about their southwest Louisiana village with the child in tow, or she could be heard calling for the child or sending the child on errands. The child speaking in English, of course. Uncle Miles adored the girl. Aunt Eva loved her. Mama, the grandmother, both adored and loved her. But on April 9th, 1935, that world crashed with the death of the grandmother, Adele Richard White, the only mother little Dorothy knew. And within a short time after the services, and allowing for mourning and with arrangements made to take the child to her real mother, little Dorothy White and her Aunt Eva White Cloud took a very long, difficult train ride to Texas. In both the Rhodes and White families' cases, the genealogists set out to put names on their trees beyond the family's written and oral traditions. Duplin Rhodes was literate and the enslaved property of Adeline Hosmer Terrell, the Hosmers of Massachusetts, the Terrells of Georgia, all of them now in Madisonville and Covington. Duplin, the literate slave, left a detailed family tree, which began with his wife, Zoe DePere Rhodes, and their children, but not their forebears. Little Dorothy White, as an adult, remembered all of her paternal and maternal adults and uncles. For both families, this was a genealogist's dream. Records with deep 19th century wells which projected forward, well, pun intended, into the 20th century. Names with direct family connections, dates, and locations, all of which came with family stories, really novel generational sticking points, oral traditions that sometimes gave pause to the historian. The Rhodes and White family searches illustrate the interconnectedness of the family record, that is, the family tree and the environment in which it grew. This is where genealogy and the formal study of history meet, where the search for lineage needs historical perspective, and where the one asks, to whom am I connected? The other asks, under what circumstances did those relationships, and I'm underscoring relationships, occur? And therefore I argue that genealogy and history are inseparable traveling companions, each a necessary component of the other. The ethnologist Judith T. Irvine asked, when is genealogy history? The culture of the griot among the Wolof, where Irvine studies in addressing the question, amplifies this question of memory and the role of the storyteller in search for fact. Irvine referenced W.H.R. Rivers' quote-unquote classic paper on the generational method. Although here I need to make a brief excursus to note that Rivers' early 20th century denigrating characterization of peoples in the South Pacific challenged this reader. Nonetheless, Rivers, Irvine noted, attributed, quoting, forgetfulness or carelessness of individual informants to the distortions of historical fact in genealogy. Irvine, the ethnologist, however, pointed out the fallacy in Rivers' position that, quote, he seems to treat questions about accuracy as an individual matter, separate from the social organization that the genealogies document. The social organization she's talking about is the collective memory of communities and cultures, that it does not reside just in one person. Irvine addresses the historian's role in genealogy, quoting her, to extract historical information from oral materials which seeks certain kinds of social conditions that promote greater accuracy than others, and how historical reconstruction is affected by the nature of the events in which historical information is communicated in the social and cultural settings of those events, unquote. Thus, generational memory informs and leads to an accurate recreation of the family's links. Historical introspection addresses the context in which the ancestors understood themselves. Moreover, historical investigation, analysis, and interpretation serve to explain the lived experiences of the very real individuals gracing a family tree. The challenge to discover the origins of Zoe DePere and Duplin Richard Rhodes initially embedded itself in the family's oral tradition. And the family knew Duplin not as Duplin, but as Duplain, a Louisiana Creole. And that Zoe, a free woman of color who was a modiste, would use her sewing skills to purchase Duplin's freedom after which they were married. This story is problematic. It's lovely romance, but it's problematic in the historical context of ante and postbellum New Orleans and St. Tammany Parish, as it does not match the legal record. Intrigue in the form of geography for the two marked their situation. Separating them were vast stretches of nearly impenetrable marsh and swamp north and east of New Orleans, leading to a 24-mile crossing, depending on where you cross the lake, of Lake Pontchartrain, plus a half-day's carriage ride from the North Shore inland to Covington. Zoe, in her freedom, had no wealth. She had no property, chattel, or land. She had no social status in New Orleans or on the North Shore. And she was either 15 or 16 years old when she met Duplin, which suggests that although free during that period, dependence defined her existence. Those interconnected circumstances uncovered the romance of a love story, as well as a utilitarian partnership, and it also laid bare the record. I'm asking you to recall that though enslaved, Duplin was literate. He could not just read. He had a beautiful script. And so information that Duplin Rhodes submitted in the 1868 to 1870 voter registration offers some credibility about his life story. He listed his age as 45, and that he lived in Louisiana for 43 years, 42 of them in Covington. Which suggests that he could have been born between 1823 and 1825, and that the 2 to 4-year-old Duplin, presumably either with parents or with both parents or with just his mother, arrived in Louisiana between 1825 and 1827 as enslaved people. Census records of 1870, which Duplin dictated the information, recorded that he was born in North Carolina. Contrary to what the family believes, he was not a French-speaking Louisiana Creole. Rather, his family's likely roots were in Duplin, same spelling, D-U-P-L-I-N, as his name, Duplin County, North Carolina. Pre-19th century Rhodes families dominated and today still populate Duplin County. Duplin apparently spent 1 year in New Orleans after being sold into slavery. Pardon me, he was already into slavery, but being sold to New Orleans and into Louisiana. And then whoever took him as a child, they took him to the North Shore of Lake Pontchartrain. And there, the extended family of Adeline Hosmer Terrell, including the Hosmer Bagley Terrell clan, plants, as I said, from Massachusetts and Georgia, took him and his mother at least. Eventually, he became just the property of Adeline Terrell and remained enslaved by her until the Civil War liberated him. Zoe, the Modiste, therefore, contrary to what the family thinks, did not buy his freedom. Although, and this is the strangest thing, although Adeline Terrell maintained a close relationship during and post-slavery with Duplin and Zoe, selling her property as a free woman, selling to both of them in both their freedoms, Terrell never freed Duplin. Again, victory in war freed him. Zoe's life story played out in religious and public records. The Rhodes family, to this day, has a wonderful, huge family Bible with Duplin's script and record. In his handwritten records are his wife Zoe's birth date, and those records matched the sacramental records at the Archdiocese in New Orleans. Zoe's father's name is omitted, but her full name, and for the first time the family got a chance to see it. Her name was Magdalene Zoe, and it listed her mother, Delcy. Both were enslaved. Matching the records that Duplin left in the sacramental records, the child was born July 5th, 1836, and she was baptized October 3rd, 1836 at St. Louis Cathedral. The baptism itself characterizes the trajectory of the Caribbean to New Orleans journey in the Atlantic world for many. Her parrain, a marin, for those of you who aren't familiar with the language, godfather and mother, were Auguste Friedrich and Magdalene Augustin, nephew and sister-in-law, respectively, of Adolphe Schreiber, who was listed in some records, despite his name, as a French immigrant. Adolphe Schreiber was Zoe and Delcy's slave owner. And listed as well was his wife, Clara Augustin, who noted that she was a native of Santiago, Cuba. But records also show that Clara Augustin, sometimes called Claire, had a slave owning business in Grenada. Nonetheless, in an 1818 slave sale began Delcy's journey through several American slave owners, related by family and or business partnerships and failures. Out of this came this 1836 birth of her daughter Zoe, whose life took the same winding road until her emancipation, sometimes between 1830s and 1850s. Memory also infects legalities, the legal record, as the court's records are not clear about Zoe's emancipation. As well, the census, which depended on the memory, often is filled with contradictions. For example, the 1870 census record shows that Zoe's father was French-born. And in the 1880 census, both of Zoe's parents are French-born. And finally, by 1900 and 1910, Zoe's parents were born in Louisiana and Virginia. Confirming that Magdalene Zoe was not a free woman her entire life, or did not buy her intended husband out of slavery, satisfies the historical record. However, the collective record of the community bears weight. That is the community's memory. Magdalene Zoe is the history of women. In this case, an African descended woman whose realities of both her and her husband's realities coincided with her resilience. In Jessica Johnson's Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Freedom in the Atlantic World, it untangles African American women's determination in French colonial Louisiana. Traversing the same Atlantic spaces as Zoe's mother, Delcy, from the Caribbean to New Orleans, Johnson seizes the essential character of women like the adult Zoe, who had 6 children. She was free and unmarried by law to a man who was the property of another woman. Sounds sinister, doesn't it? A woman, by the way, who would not set him free. Women, as Johnson introduces them, quoting, were engaged in and were forced to engage in intimate relations across gender and race with individuals enslaved and free. They established families beyond biological kin and across race and status. They accumulated property and distributed legacies across generations, unquote. Magdalene Zoe, meet Amelia Richard, born enslaved in 1842 in the Opelousas region of Big Cane. Amelia Richard's emotional, descended story weaves from her mid-19th century enslavement to the 21st century. Amelia's 12-year-old daughter, the offspring of her owner, was sold amid Amelia's painful wailing. Richard, the slave owner, assured the slave Amelia that this child's new master bought her to take special care with her. The 12-year-old became, quoting, a fancy girl. The term historian Edward Baptist derived from the historical record to describe an enslaved victim's purpose was involved in sexual assault. Reportedly, Amelia passionately whispered to this child, "Remember, you are a Richard." The whisper resounded in successive generations. Amelia told it to Adele Richard White, who was Amelia's other daughter. Adele Richard White, the mother of the little 9-year-old Dorothy, the grandmother, related it to her 9 children, and they to their children, and finally Adele to the 9-year-old Dorothy. Perhaps Duplin's mother told him and whispered to him that his name was a place name in North Carolina. And if she did, it led a historian straight to Duplin County and the 18th and 19th centuries Rhodes families. In the 20th century, to her death in 1935, townspeople, white and black, knew a loving but stern Adele Richard White. They called her doctor. All the residents came to her for healing, for comfort to the dying, and to deliver their babies and care for the mothers. Adele Richard White cared for and witnessed the death of her father in the early 19-teens, and Adele's mother, who died just 5 years before Adele died in 1935. And even the way that the community saw her was not enough, because still Jim Crow's priests refused her and little Dorothy the sacraments in the same room as non-black people. But Adele Richard White took little Dorothy and took the sacrament over the threshold. The train ride must have been mournful and simultaneously fearful for both the 9-year-old Dorothy and her Aunt Eva. They arrived to Dorothy's maternal family in Houston, who had migrated from Southwest Louisiana for work. Once Eva deposited Dorothy and witnessed her welcoming ceremony with her birth mother, Eva left. Eva disappeared in 1937, and no one ever knew what happened to her. They didn't know where she was, and no one heard about her again until a 21st century historian matched information with a Texas death certificate. Eva Cloud became ill on her return to Louisiana, and she ended up in the Negro Hospital in Galveston, Texas, attended by an unsupervised intern who performed, according to the record, an ileostomy, that is, an opening in the abdominal wall made during surgery. Eva died from, quoting, shock following the operation. The record says she was buried in a pauper's grave. She has been found because of family memory, that collective memory, that was embedded in the playful makeup time with her niece. Historical examination should engage the realities of collective memory, as the ethnologist Irvine says, not as fallacies, rather as part of a larger lived experience that can inform historical perspective. Here is where and how truth and truths may be discovered in the searches for lineages, that's genealogy, and perspective, that's history. There are several ways that history, formal study of history, can engage genealogies that we can get from these stories, among the many. One, women's experiences. How was the 9-year-old Dorothy realized through her adult life? In the experiences of Delcy, Zoe, Amelia, Adele, Eva, and for that matter, Claire Augustin, and Adeline Hosmer Terrell's prodigy, along with Jessica Johnson's recent text, see also Sophie White's Voices of the Enslaved, Love, Labor, and Longing in French Louisiana, among many others like them. Historians and genealogists could engage by informing things like, as discussed here, literacy in the time of troubles. We're historians, we know. Slaves were never taught to read and write. Well, that's what the public says, but the record and experiences, especially in Duplin's case, is different. Who taught and under what conditions was Duplin Rhodes taught to read and write? The inference here is that Adeline Terrell taught him, but the record doesn't show that. The historian tried to get the records from the family. They went silent. Also, investigate the influx of Northeasterners. You know, slavery is a Southern thing, right? But in numerous texts, we see Northeasterners coming south and engaging in slavery. This is what happened with the Hosmers from Massachusetts, who settled down in Madisonville, Louisiana, and ultimately some of them in Covington. The next point is, we can ask, how does Louisiana fit in the larger Atlantic world trajectory? Sylvia Fry, Emily Clark, Roseanne Adderley, Jessica Johnson, among many others, explores this subject and informs it, and could inform the genealogists to answer their questions on how did people and under what conditions did people get from one place to the other in the Atlantic world. The next point is not only Tuskegee. We heard lots about Tuskegee and black people when the pandemic started. But those of us at my institution, HBCUs, when students brought it up, we had to say, it wasn't that they were giving them bad medicine, they kept the medicine from them at Tuskegee. So not only Tuskegee, but the Negro Hospital of Galveston the Negro departments in hospitals. What happened to marginalized people? Negroes, poor whites, and other non-Anglo peoples, what happened to them? How do we inform the family tree search when they find out something happened at the hospital? We don't want to leave it just with the Negroes, as I said, but even when we study, a progressive like Margaret Sanger, hailed as a feminist for her activism on behalf of women's self-determination, yet she focused her reproductive control on poor white women, Italians, Eastern Europeans, Eastern European Jews, and others that they felt should not produce children like themselves. I would direct people to explore Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, and one of my favorite, Nancy Eisenberg's 2016 White Trash, The 400-Year Untold History of Class in America, and the recently published Heather McGee's The Sum of Us, the S-U-M of us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. I asked them, historians, to help genealogists examine the migrations of the cultures and understand cultures and not just the conditions of people. Little 9-year-old Dorothy White is such a wonderful person and a mind. She's 96 years old. She called the historian to say, "I've just finished reading The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration. And I have seen the experiences of myself, my family, my friends, as they moved from Southwest Louisiana to Southeast Texas to Southern and Northern California." And the historian said, "I have another piece for you. You want to read? Send it to me." So she read, "Goodbye, God. I'm going to Texas." The migration of Louisiana's Creoles of color and the preservation of Black Catholic and Creole traditions in Southeast Texas by Glenn Chambers in the Journal of Religion and Popular Culture. She identified all those institutions that Southwest Louisianians brought to Southeast Texas. I know them. I could tell you all about them. And just briefly, I need to tell you. She said, "You know, I'm 96. Yes. My children gave me Barack Obama's last book. I better get to read it because I don't know how much longer I have." Also explore the role of language in retaining culture. Dorothy's grandmother took care to speak English to her, even though the adults all spoke as their first language Creole French. So we know that in the 1920s, especially to attract industry, Louisiana forbade speaking French in public spaces, especially in schools. And there are several documentaries and written research on this topic. And Dorothy's grandmother and adults were careful that she could not speak English. She understood it for a long time. And then I think in Texas, she started losing it. Presently, genealogy and historical study operate with little attention to the other. But I'm here to tell you that genealogy has not waited for history's insight. Literally, thousands of organizations dedicate themselves to genealogy as we speak. Ancestry.com reports 3 million people subscribe to its services. Not to mention FamilySearch.org or any of a number of other places. Not-for-profit groups offer how-to tutorials on genealogy. They offer support. I research the numbers of organizations in Louisiana. There are 87 such groups in Louisiana doing genealogy. By contrast, only one Louisiana university, LSU Shreveport, offers what they call a genealogy basics course. Its description notes that there are 6 weeks access, 12 lessons, and 24 course hours. It's, quote, a hands-on, and it comes with access to subscription-based websites. The LSU Libraries offers research tools. Xavier University in New Orleans supports the Louisiana Creole Research Association with facilities. And they've encouraged 1 or 2 of their faculty members to offer courses in Creole history. Nicholls State University has its Ellender Archives Genealogy Collection. And Northwestern State University, since 1998, has its Creole Heritage Center and a genealogical department. Quoting from their description, at Northwestern, it has broadened from just the study of the Cane River Creoles to a range that includes the entire state of Louisiana, as well as Creole colonies located nationwide. There's also an international publication just called Creoles, Kreole. That's an online free newsletter that covers a lot of things in Louisiana as well as in other areas of the Caribbean and West Africa. In sum, a mutual association and interaction of scholars and researchers, of the historians and the genealogists, informs and discovers truths. The historian could go to the record based on what the families of the Rhodes and the Whites remembered. And in doing so, it uncovered truths and a better understanding of themselves. According to the University of Louisiana, Lafayette, genealogical research, quote, requires a strong grounding in history to comprehend their nature and biases, unquote. It took me 13 pages, almost a half hour, to demonstrate that, as it is the position of this paper. And I wholeheartedly endorse that statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.